But I really appreciate you taking your time, Nick. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Mike.
So, how far back does, I guess, should we go back to talk about maybe the ancient aliens? Like, what is your thought? What is your belief whenever it comes to the gods, either with the big case G or the lowercase g?
Uh-huh.
How far back are we looking at here?
Well, I mean, it's hard to put sort of a specific date on things because, you read a lot of ancient texts, ancient manuscripts, that kind of thing. And in many of them, there are actually no dates. They're just very old manuscripts. Like, for example, the Indian Mahabharata. We know it's thousands of years old, but there's a lot of debate as to exactly how many. So today we're sort of forced to try and figure out through archaeology and history and looking at these ancient texts to try and figure out exactly the timeline that we're talking about. But I mean, what we know for sure is that sort of civilization, began to develop, thousands of years ago. There was a period, obviously, when it was pretty much static, where we were living in a primitive state, and then sort of 7,000-8,000 years ago, things started to sort of speed up, and basic technology, farming, that kind of thing started to develop. People put roots down, towns, villages, that kind of thing, and then just society then starts to progress. And if we look at the Bible, the Mahabharata, etc., we find the sort of surfacing of civilization. But what's interesting is that in many of these ancient books, you'll find references to how the so-called gods would come down and assist the people in terms of upgrading our technology and our knowledge. A good example, if you look at the Mesoamerican stories of Quetzalcoatl, this sort of enigmatic godlike figure, which introduced sort of rudimentary technology to the Mesoamericans. You have the same thing, in the Middle East, the stories of the gods coming down from the sky, and etc. So I find it intriguing that the early development of human society is tied in with sort of manifestations from supernatural beings, if you like.
And I'm not really a very religious person, but I do think, think that the Bible they do have, it's pretty much a history, and of course some things are written in metaphor, of course, but one thing that they, I believe, do have correct in there, according to, Zechariah Sitchin's work, Erich Doniken's work, and many others, that they talk about the gods in Genesis, let us make man in our image and after our likeness.
Yeah.
Do you think that that is the actual literal terminology of what actually happened back then, that the gods came here and man was already here on Earth? Primitive man, I guess maybe part of the natural evolution of Earth, possibly. So do you think that they came here and intervened and pretty much gave their DNA, because they found the women attractive, according with the Bible, the fallen angels found the women attractive, and they implanted their DNA into the women, and that's how the spark came of the natural evolution that was already here on Earth? What is your thought on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, you can look through just about every ancient text, and you find not just the gods coming down to Earth, but interacting with us directly. You have the stories of the giants, the legendary giants, or the gods taking human wives and creating half god, half human demigods, so to speak. And you can find them in all cultures. And for me, I think when you look at the history of early man, like Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal man, things like that, we know that they were fairly highly evolved. There's no doubt about that. If you look at the remains and the digs, the archaeological digs that have been undertaken where a Neanderthal man has been found, there's evidence of fertility rites, of an understanding of what death was, that, they buried their dead. They understood that there was something, to be revered. It wasn't just a case of throwing the bodies away. And even evidence of musical instruments that they may have created. So they weren't just a bunch of guys, dressed in a bear skin with a club and, dragging his wife back to the cave or anything like that. That's sort of the classic kind of imagery that people have, but it wasn't like that. But in saying that, although they were evolved, then what we had was this jump with Homo sapiens, us, to where, we performed, if it was us that did it, some incredible feats. We went from living in caves and living fairly dangerous lives, predators chasing us, bears, saber-toothed tigers, whatever. We're constantly on the run. And then in no time at all, really, we've gone from there to creating things like Stonehenge, the pyramids, and we've really elevated ourselves. Now, of course, is it a case that we did it on our own? It was just like evolutionary jumps, or did we get some assistance? Now, if you look at particularly the Bible, the stories of God, creating man in his own image, however you interpret the words, basically it's saying that man is similar to the gods or the God in terms of its appearance. And I think when you look further into the Bible itself, you can actually make a case that there are references to what sounds like DNA manipulation. I mean, for example, the whole issue of Eve being created out of one of Adam's ribs. Now, if you think of it literally, you cannot make a person out of a rib. It's impossible. But that may well be like a distorted account of a genuine event. Perhaps, extracting DNA from the body or the bone or the skin of someone, possibly in a cloning type situation, and mixing it all up with the original sort of proto-humans, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, etc., and upgrading the species, essentially, and creating this new type of human, Homo sapiens. And when you look at it like that, you can make a good case. And on top of that, of course, the Bible actually says that when Adam's rib was removed to create Eve, he was placed into what was called like a great sleep, which actually sounds like he was anaesthetized for surgery, and of course, people who interpret the Bible liberally would by this time would be probably throwing rocks at me, But you can play, if you take it out of the religious context, you can put it in sort of a medical, scientific context as well. And of course, what we see from that interaction with the gods is the almost spontaneous development of these giants around the planet, that legendary giants like Goliath, and you have people like King Gilgamesh of Uruk, who was described as being incredibly tall and long-lived, which is what we're also told about some of these ancient extraterrestrials, like the Anunnaki and things like that. And I think when you put all those issues together, the gods, quote, gods coming down from the sky, the alterations to the human species, the genetic angle, the development of these half-human demigods, it does sound like somebody came down and on a massive scale sort of interfered with the pre-existing human species and elevated them into a significant degree.
One of my theories, and I have stated this on other interviews as well, and it's kind of based on many other researchers' theories also. I just kind of gather bits and pieces and kind of create my own conclusion. Yeah. But, okay, there are pyramids all over the world. Mm-hmm. So let's say that the story with the gods coming here is true. Mm-hmm. Gods with the S. They came here, and let's say that they were kind of like generals in the military. Mm-hmm. They came here and they landed all over the world. Mm-hmm. And so they created their technology and gave a boost in, I guess, advanced, I guess, kind of helping the people there the primitive people there kind of to give them a jump start in society. So they gave them the technology to build these pyramids all over the world. So that's why we have pyramids in South America, even Middle East, India, Japan, United States, and even say there's pyramids in Antarctica. So my theory is it possible that with these gods that they came here and gave them the technology to build these pyramids, do you think that I guess what I'm trying to say is there were good, and I think there are possibly good and bad generals or gods, whatever you want to say, that landed all over the world. And over the past thousands of years in the Middle East, what have we had, especially the past 1,000 years? Wars, famines, rumors of wars, fighting. My God is better than yours, especially in the Middle East. So is it possible that one of the gods that landed in the Middle East, around the Egypt area, but the Middle East, it's close. They were evil, and they started this infighting, this hatred, this violence, and this path of destruction over the past couple thousands of years up until modern day. And that's why we still are in this endless loop, especially in the Middle East, with all that war and violence that's going on. What do you think about that, Nick?
Well, yeah, I mean, if our DNA was altered and encoded with, the DNA of extraterrestrials, and they were fairly, violent, warlike, that might explain why we try and do the right things, but equally the human race is a very war-driven species. Other than us, there aren't really many other creatures on the planet that will kill other animals for anything other than food. That food that's nature. That's what you have to do. But in terms of killing people for the sake of it, or torturing them, or going to war, it's really just us. And you have to wonder why that is. Is it just because we're almost like a unique species, or is it because something is encoded in us that makes us like that? That we are kind of self-destructive. And
are you kind of a subscriber to possibly David Icke's theory that we have the reptilian part of the brain, and it kind of creates this violence amongst us?
Well, I'm not sure.
The ego of humankind.
Yeah, I'm not sure what would prompt it, other than the fact that that's how it is. That's how we are. And it's kind of just the same. You stand at the traffic lights and the guy takes 10 seconds to pull away, and you're like, come on. People just lose it quickly. Most animals aren't like that. But if you compare that to what you mentioned about how even the gods, even if they were from one planet or more, they had turf wars. I mean, you look at the stories of the Anunnaki, how they supposedly splintered into different groups and had turf wars, which may have led to sort of localized nuclear attacks on each other, particularly in the Middle East, and may have provoked the legends of things like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which, with hindsight, if you read that sounds eerily like, a nuclear attack. And of course, when Lot was visited by these mysterious figures who basically said, get the hell out of Dodge because, we're going to destroy the city. That doesn't sound like a random meteorite coming down, because it was planned, and they were given time to get out of the town and told, to keep going, don't look back. Well, the don't look back angle, you could tie that in with the flash from a nuclear explosion. A lot of people don't know that if, God forbid, ever happened, but in a nuclear war, you could be 20 miles away from the really powerful ones that we have today and not get killed by the blast, but you could be blinded by the flash. It literally melts your retina if you look right at it. So that's why they may have been told, don't look back. And of course, Lot's wife looked back. But in some translations, it's actually that she turned back, which is a very different thing. Now, if she turned back and decided to go back to the city, then that brings in the issue of where she was supposedly turned into a pillar of salt. Now, an atomic weapon can't do that. But one of the alternative words for a pillar of salt is actually a pillar of vapor. Now, that may mean she was vaporized, and that's one of the sort of the really disturbing aspects of the atomic bombs and the powerful ones we have today. If, again, God forbid it happened, you know, an atomic bomb went off in downtown Dallas, which is not far from where I live, anybody within a couple of miles radius of the immediate detonation point will be vaporized. There'll be nothing left. It'll just be ash and dust everywhere. So that could explain the whole angle of Sodom, Gomorrah. So Lot's wife made, you know, the biggest mistake possible. And of course, there's one other intriguing thing, was that Lot and his two daughters actually hid out in a deep cave. Now, although the Bible doesn't mention this, they may have been told to do that because that would, in part at least, protect them from radiation. You know, you need to be underground or well protected to ensure that you're not going to be, you know, affected by radiation. You know, again, in like a nuclear war, you could be in a house where the doors are okay, the windows are fine, the roof's still on, you're far enough away from the detonation point, but you've got your air conditioner going on, there's radiation in the air and it's sucking the radiation in through the air outside, and then within 3 or 4 days you're throwing up blood, you know, and so
do you think that there are ties to Sodom and Gomorrah and the Mahabharata?
Yeah.
Do you think that it's possible that there is a connection during, are these timelines, these with this event,
yeah,
was it about the same time period that there were just wars, these nuclear wars going all over the world?
Well, it's interesting that they may not actually been at the same time. Now, if we went to war today, you know, the entire northern hemisphere, the western hemisphere, you know, the Western world would be destroyed. There's no doubt about that at all. You know, nobody can win a nuclear war. It's impossible if everybody unleashes their weapons. But I think what we're seeing in the distant past is not sort of like a worldwide nuclear war. What we're seeing seems to be localized nuclear exchanges in varying time frames. I'll explain what I mean by that. Now, the Mahabharata, we don't really know how far that goes back. Some people say 3,000 years. Some people said 5, 7. Other people think it could be tens of thousands of years old, but that the Mahabharata as we know it may have been a rewrite of an even more ancient story. So if that's the case, we could have had localized Anunnaki type confrontations in India, in northern India, which is what the Mahabharata talks about, this idea of these two warring factions going to war, you know, and these stories of destruction of cities and, you know, incredible weapons used and so on, and these flying craft known as Vimana streaking through the skies. But I don't think necessarily that ties in time-wise with what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. I think we're looking more along the lines of what we might one day use, with sort of tactical nukes to, you know, somebody's really caused us problems and it's down to the wire, but you don't want to destroy a city that's 20 miles away where there's 4 million people. So you use a localized small nuclear device which will completely wipe out the target, but it won't do too much damage, you know, on a larger scale. And I wouldn't be surprised when it comes to things like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot and his family were given time to escape and just keep going. That doesn't sound like something that, you know, we would use today, but it does sound like one of these tactical nukes that, you know, can be used on the battlefield or whatever. So what it could be is, you know, you, depending on how long the Anunnaki or whatever you want to call them, you know, just visitors from wherever, it could be the case that if they were here long enough and they were sort of arrogant enough, they just unleashed nuclear weapons at each other when they chose to. It could have been across centuries or thousands of years. I think from our perspective, we assume that it must all be going on at the same time, because if it happened with us and it started to erupt and it expanded, everybody would be, launching their missiles. But it could be the case with them, if they had little factions around the world, that, it would not be an all-out war. It would just be turf wars.
For those that are unfamiliar with the Mahabharata, go in a little bit of detail, in depth of that, of the story.
Well, the Mahabharata tells a story of sort of a major disaster in northern India, and including these two specific warring factions from India, which were described as people, which is interesting because there are stories about the Anunnaki supposedly sharing their technology with the humans who were in their favour, so to speak. So what we might have here is ancient humans in northern India actually having access to Anunnaki-type weaponry. And, it doesn't matter if it's 2,000, 3,000 years ago, a human could be taught to do this or to do that. They didn't have the technology to understand it back then, but you could be taught it. And so you have this story, these two warring factions going to war. But you would imagine, 4, 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, we'd be talking about guys on horseback, shields, swords, spears, lances, that kind of thing. But that's not what the Mahabharata, this ancient, massive tome, if you like, tells us. What it does tell us is that these two opposing sides went to war with these flying machines known as Vimanas. Now, nobody really knows what Vimanas look like. I mean, there are some sort of cool artwork online, which is sort of really weird stuff. They're almost like flying pyramids and crossed with balloons and things like this. Other people have suggested, they're the closest thing to like a Top Gun type aircraft that we have today. And so wherever the truth lies, the fact is that in ancient India there is a long tradition of technological devices that could take to the skies, and that they would be sort of primed with powerful weaponry. And the story is that these Vimanas would unleash these incredible weapons that could destroy cities, could wipe people out, just massive destruction. And if you read the translations, it kind of parallels Sodom and Gomorrah, the idea of incredible weapons just flattening cities, which is not what you would expect from a book written multiple thousands of years ago. And the Mahabharata is certainly today one of the more kind of important documents, if you like, for people who suggest that there has been ancient nuclear war.
So, where does in your book, The Secret History, Conspiracies from Ancient Aliens to the New World Order, you also talk about the Ark of the Covenant, a deadly weapon. Now, how far back are we talking about here, and what was this weapon used for?
Well, I mean, the Ark of the Covenant, surfaces in the Old Testament, and there's been a great deal of debate as to exactly what the Ark was. I mean, it played a major role in the Indiana Jones film Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you had the Nazis trying to get their hands on it and weaponize it. Yeah, it's a good film. And a lot of people don't realise that there was some truth to that, in the sense that the Nazis really did have a group that sort of travelled the world trying to get their hands on ancient artefacts like the Spear of Destiny and things like that. And because Hitler and a lot of the leading Nazis were very driven by the world of the occult, and thankfully, we beat them. But I mean, there were times when it actually got close, where the war could have gone the other way. We'd all be talking German today if they'd won. But with the Ark of the Covenant, one of the interesting things is that people were warned not to get too close to it, and there were stories of people touching it and just falling dead. And this has given rise to the theory that it may have possessed like a very powerful electrical current, that it may have been an electrical device. There are stories that the Ark of the Covenant may have been used to help bring down the walls of Jericho. Now, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the walls of Jericho are brought down by trumpets, the sound of trumpets. Now, I don't believe that is true, but what it does sound very much like is sort of not so much fringe technology, but technology that's still under development now, sort of acoustic weapons, which sort of sound-based energy directed can actually have an effect on not just physical buildings, but also on people. If you're targeted by an acoustic weapon, it could cause heart palpitations, dizziness, nausea, fainting, and it's just because the very low frequency sound can actually have a deep bearing on the human nervous system. But also, if you've got some sort of high-tech acoustic weapon and you directed it at ancient walls, you can bring them down, and so you're effectively using sound. So over time, and stories spread orally and over generation and another generation, the idea of the Ark of the Covenant being some sort of acoustic weapon gets over time translated as trumpets. And you can see how it wouldn't be a case of lying. It would be a distortion over generations of an acoustic weapon becoming the music being played by a trumpet, because back then they wouldn't necessarily have had a full understanding what an acoustic weapon was, but they would still remember there was a sound aspect. And also, the Ark of the Covenant supposedly played a role in the parting of the Red Sea. So, whatever this mysterious box was, and it wasn't a gigantic thing, it was sort of, the size of a suitcase or, a bit bigger, but it was sort of very much revered and hidden as well. And, even today, there's people still trying to figure out where it is, where it's hidden.
Where do you think that the Ark of the Covenant really came from, and why was it? Do you think that was given from the gods as a weapon to use against maybe other evils?
Well, it could be. I find it doubtful that we would have developed something so quickly out of the blue, because I think we would have seen other examples. If every nation in the Middle East back then had something along the lines of the Ark of the Covenant, you could say, well, they developed it together, or the technology started roughly in the same area. So I think the chances are it was given to us. Certain people were briefed on how it worked, what the dangers were, why it was important not to get too close to it at certain points, and how it had massively destructive powers as well. But beyond that, we're still sort of struggling to really figure out what it actually was.
So, of course, Hitler was trying to find the Spear of Destiny, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Let's say that he did retrieve these objects, or he didn't. Regardless, do you think that the, whatever you want to call them, the deep cabal, the Illuminati, the people, the elite, whatever terminology you want to put on these figureheads, do you think that this rogue group, had this type of hidden technology or these artifacts in some deep dark bunker somewhere, or possibly even the Vatican Library or something like that?
Well, they may well, because there are a lot of stories about sort of, I won't say this government or that government. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds almost like a powerful elite, sort of very, very powerful secret society worldwide that understands a lot of the secrets of the distant past and is determined to kind of upgrade it for the modern era, or to use the pre-existing secrets that have been lost and find them and use them for their own end. A good example is just a few years ago, the CIA declassified about 40 pages of a file that it has on Noahs Ark. Now, you think of Noahs Ark, you would think of archaeologists, historians, people who follow the Bible having an interest in this. You'd think, why on earth would the CIA have an interest in Noah's Ark? The story of a big old ship, on Mount Ararat. So the big question is, why would the CIA be interested? Now, we don't really know, but what we do know is that back in 1949, the US Air Force actually had a spy plane flying over Turkey, heading towards the border with the former Soviet Union. They passed by Mount Ararat, and one of the guys on the plane said, "Wow, what's that?" And it looked like a portion of a large ship embedded in the ice near the top of Mount Ararat. And they just quickly sort of, turned the plane to a different angle, shot about 7 or 8 pictures, which were then made their way to the Pentagon. But there was more to it. There are rumours that it actually didn't look like an old wooden boat, that it was possibly even something metallic. Now, what's interesting is among these files, which the CIA has declassified, there are references to how the CIA actually sent out 2 personnel to sit in the audience at a lecture given on Noah's Ark in 1975. And again, why would the CIA even be interested in what was being talked about Noah's Ark in 75? So are we looking at agencies doing it on the behalf of some other organisation to figure out some of these secrets? And another example is that Miles Copeland, who was a senior CIA operative who worked in the Middle East in the late 1940s, Miles Copeland, after his retirement, had a very interesting story to tell about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, and that they tell sort of a fantastic and informative story of early history, that ties in with the biblical stories and the people of that era. But what happened was that in 1947, when Miles Copeland was based out of Damascus at a CIA office there, a guy came in one day and basically gave him this collection of ancient texts. And it turns out that when they were deciphered and translated, they were another example of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Copeland was ordered to have all this material packaged up, and again, like the Noah's Ark stuff, it was sent to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And that particular scroll has never been seen publicly. We think all the ones that were found, are now on public display, and we can all see them. The one that we can't see is the one that the CIA got their hands on. And what's interesting is that, according to Miles Copeland, it was focused on the book of Daniel, and it had reportedly references to like a lot of prophetic dreams of future events and things like that. So, who knows what was in there? But the issue of future events is interesting. Now, of course, the other angle which plays into this, which relates to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when you had the looting of the Baghdad Museum in Iraq, and that is sort of a huge place which contains an incredible number of ancient artifacts from not just Iraq but various places around the Middle East. And when the Iraq war began, obviously everything was in turmoil and anarchy, and the military did its best to prevent looting from going on. Some people have sort of pointed the finger at the US government in this angle, but I don't personally think that's the case. Again, I think there's a powerful elite that has the ability to just do what it wants to do, and they stepped in and even weren't even answerable to the the US government. But what happened was that massive amounts of material were looted from the museum. Now, when the US military went in to try and help stabilise what was going on at the museum and prevent the looting from occurring, what the team found was that what appeared at first glance to be random looting and just anarchy, etc., etc., actually wasn't. It seemed that whoever had been doing it wanted it to look like looting, but they'd actually targeted certain portions of the museum, and certain well-prized artifacts were gone. Now, there are stories that not long before the invasion occurred, that what happened was that a number of ancient artifacts relating to King Gilgamesh were found. Now, King Gilgamesh used to rule, thousands of years ago, ruled over Uruk, which is today part of Iraq. And he was supposedly like a demigod, a half Anunnaki, half human. He was sort of 12, 13 foot tall, ruled for like 130 years. We don't know how old he was when he came to power, so he could have lived to like 160, which is not a normal person, you know. You put his height together, his longevity. And there are also stories that certain ancient manuscripts concerning Gilgamesh, they also allegedly found that out in the desert of Uruk, references to ancient manuscripts that concerned Gilgamesh, which made their way to the museum. And so if there were profound secrets found on King Gilgamesh, who may well have been related to extraterrestrials, who had given him the secrets of longevity, not necessarily immortality, but certainly massive longevity, and all of this material was handed over to the museum, and then suddenly it goes missing, you have to wonder if these stories about a worldwide elite trying to design, if you like, some form of immortality for them, while the rest of us still just get our measly 80 or 90 years, you know. It actually makes sense. And as I said, even the US military came to believe quite quickly that this was not random looting, that it was somebody was targeting the museum for certain priceless objects, which may well have opened the door to understanding our early origins, the nature of immortality, how the Anunnaki may have achieved their incredible lifespans, and these people today are determined to have what they had X number of thousands of years ago.
Exactly. And when it comes to our ancient past, with our governments of the world, why are they keeping these artifacts and this all secret? Everything from the Middle East to the spirit destiny, all of that. Why are they keeping this hidden? The story, pretty much the history of mankind, especially when it comes to these incredible artifacts of our past. Why are they keeping it to themselves and out of the public reach?
I think there's probably at least two reasons as to why we're not being told the full story of what's known about our ancient histories. I think one of them is because the issue of, if all this information comes out, what it may show is that we weren't visited by gods, we were visited by extraterrestrials. Now, in today's world, most of the problems are caused by religion. If the world is then told, well, actually, religion is a distortion of extraterrestrial visitations, there would be just worldwide religious chaos. And, everybody would be going to war with each other, because how dare you say this about my God, and bombs really would be flying around left, right and centre on a massive scale. So I think part of it's the fear of upsetting the status quo, the balance and the order of the planet, along the lines of, we just cannot tell people that religion is a distortion of extraterrestrial visitation. The second reason, I think, is that we have an elite. However you view it, there is an elite that are sort of really pulling the strings of the planet. People say, oh, well, it's the CIA, it's the Pentagon. It's not. I actually don't think a lot of the terrible things that have been done by governments. The government is always painted as the bad guy, but I do think there are incredibly powerful cabals networked together that get things done in a way that even a government can't. And I think this elite is not only ruthless, it's arrogant to the point where they don't want everybody else to have what they have. I think it comes really just down to not just ego, but a sense of creating this elite and bit by bit, obliterating the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to this looting in Iraq, one theory is that we went over there to actually, or we came across a Stargate. Mm. Now, what is your thoughts on that? Have you heard of that?
Yeah,
that theory?
I have. The Stargate angle for the war of Iraq is an interesting one, but it is a controversial one, and I would like to see more evidence for it. But what I would say, the idea of some sort of Stargate, an ancient Stargate that could allow us to sort of jump from one location to another, rather than having to travel literally from point A to point B across, however many light years, which would make it impossible for us right now. But the idea of the Stargate may actually tie in with a verifiable aspect of science, namely wormholes. The idea that you can essentially shorten a journey by literally manipulating time and space. So, in other words, you have a means to travel incredible distances, but in an extremely short period of time. So maybe an ancient Stargate would allow something like the Anunnaki to come back and forth from the planet, which would make far more sense than having to, even if you got the most powerful technology, having to keep flying from one solar system to another, taking incredible times. If you could be there in the click of a finger, then you've got a really revolutionary technology. And I think when you're looking at something like a Stargate, everybody is going to want to get their hands on that. So, I don't rule that out at all. I think, the Stargate angle would be a very reasonable reason for actually going in. Now, I don't think, the whole war in Iraq was just a cover for that. I think, we legitimately went in for legitimate reasons that, were put forward. But I think probably what happened was that there was a realization that where this was going on, there were these mysteries that needed to be solved and potential ancient technologies to be found. And so it was, the timing was right, if you like, to also have something else going on at the same time in the same place, which was detracted by the war itself.